Okay, I think we need to talk. And this talk, hear me out, is for the purpose of more meaningful talks about something we clearly commonly love, which is camera gear. I think we need to have this talk because, well, one, people are getting toxic, and two, things are not getting across because of number one. So in this video, let's talk about three important factors that we shouldn't forget about camera gear. Okay, so you're probably just like me. Conversations about camera gear are part of my daily diet. In fact, I start reading articles, I start watching content, and I start reading comments way before I start having breakfast. So it's literally part of my daily diet. And I've been doing gear reviews for F stoppers for exactly 6 years this month, and even more years before that, so roughly around 10 years in total. And because of that, I've gotten so used to these patterns that I see from people, and I think it's finally time to start talking about them so that we can hopefully raise a better culture within the industry, because it's a big community, but at the small time, it's a small community, and we're better off just being friends with one another. So these are three things that I found that people tend to forget whenever talking about recommending and considering camera gear. And the goal of these, aside from meaningful conversations, is that for you to remember them when you are actually considering specific pieces of gear. The first one is perhaps the most crucial, and it's purpose. Another term would be use case. Whenever we're talking about cameras, lenses, even tripods or bags, a very important piece of the puzzle would be use case, context. Where would you be using these for? And I'm saying this even though it already seems so obvious, because a lot of people tend to read spec sheets like it's everything. Now, of course, whenever there's a new piece of gear, there's a new product out in the market, then technically, the first thing we ever have access to would be a spec sheet. However, something that's more important than that would be putting the specs into context. For example, without context, you would think that, say, the A7S III would be a far inferior camera compared to the Sony ZV-E10. Why? Because you'd be looking at a 20 megapixel on the ZV-E10 and a 12 megapixel on the A7S III. But the other factors, such as the sensor size and the purpose, more importantly, would be taken out of consideration. And there are, of course, more realistic applications of this. But I'm saying this because also I tend to hear the word best a lot. And I don't know if you're someone who's watching this video and you've been watching my other videos for the past 5 years on YouTube, then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I don't use the word best so much, especially when there is no context. But on social media, you would commonly hear the word, this is the best camera, this is the best lens, this is the best camera in the world, the best camera from Sony, the best camera from Canon, blah, 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 blah. But in reality, there is no fair comparison between all of these when there is no context. For example, you might say this is the best lens for landscape photography, and you're talking about the telephoto lens. And in some cases, it is. In some cases, it's not. Now, if some beginner just wanted to try out landscape photography and they got that best lens, which was a telephoto in that particular piece of content they were watching, then it would be a hit or miss. They would either go to a place and zoom in and just be amazed of all the details that they could get from far away, or the opposite, which is they went shooting waterfalls and they're shooting from a very close vantage point, which means that they probably are very up close to the waterfalls And the best lens did not perform because it was the wrong lens for the wrong purpose, right? In the same way, if that same person got the best lens, the telephoto lens in this scenario, and they went shooting interiors, and all they could get were tight details of the interiors because it was a tight space. And the best lens for that situation would have been some sort of a wide angle lens. You get what I'm saying? We tend to forget about context whenever we're talking about gear when it's the most important, because you should only be getting gear if you have a certain use for it, if you have a certain purpose for it. And if not, well, if you're a collector, then go ahead. But if not, then context, purpose, use case should always, always, always be considered. Now, in the same way that purpose and use case greatly affect suitability, this second one does as well. And I am talking about ergonomics and or logistics. You see, photography is both a creative and a physical task. Now, for some people, it is probably 95% creative and 5% a physical task. For other people like myself, for example, it might be a 70% physical task and a 30% creative task. Why? Because we tend to hike before we get to shoot whatever we want to shoot. Or we need to prepare a lot of things, get the gear ready, and go on location before we get to that few minutes of actually shooting. In reality, some workflows are way more physical than others. Think of a landscape photographer on top of a mountain and a portrait photographer inside the studio. The physical aspect of it can be very different, and that is why logistics matters. If we go back again to the example of the best lens. For example, I'm a Sony user. I like telephoto lenses for landscape photography, and the best telephoto lens, the best 70-200 for Sony, is the 70-200 f2.8 GM2. Clearly, the image quality is superior to the GM1 and to the F4 versions. However, if I'm climbing a mountain and I'm gonna bring 3 or 4 different lenses with 2 camera bodies, the difference between the 70-200 f2.8 GM2 and the 70-200 f4 G2 is going to be very much significant. Which means that weight is going to add up to the weight of all of the pieces of gear that I'm going to be carrying on my back for 8 hours that day, 12 hours that day, maybe multiple days. I haven't been on a multi-day hike in a while, but you get my point, right? That say 300-400 gram difference is going to add up to 300-400 gram differences with other lenses and other camera bodies, and that's gonna add up to whatever I would have to carry. So sometimes when we're comparing pieces of gear, we actually have to find the middle ground between what is optically the best and what is ergonomically and logistically the best. And sometimes the middle ground is actually something in between, and sometimes it's one or the other. So that's very important to consider. So sometimes more than the output, or at least equal to the gravity of the output, would be the things that would make things more efficient or make things easier for the photographer to do. Ergonomics, when it comes to complex workflows, can actually mean so much because it can shorten a very long process into a few seconds just because a specific camera or lens or piece of gear, say a tripod, is better ergonomically designed than the other. It doesn't mean that ergonomics would take precedence over resolution and image quality, but it does have more weight than we give it. Now, the third important factor is something that we should all consider and respect from one another: preference. At the end of the day, regardless of what they can afford, regardless of all the specs, and regardless of all the reviews, it all boils down to a person's preference. In fact, whenever I get questions from people, from friends more importantly, when they're torn between two specific cameras or two specific lenses, my advice, whenever applicable, would always be try and take it for a spin. In fact, that's something I do myself as well. Whenever I'm choosing between two cameras and I can't make up my mind, I ask to take it for a spin. Luckily, that is possible most cases than not. Now, this is true because of two reasons. Number one is literally the physical feel of your gear will matter with your comfort. Whenever you're comfortable with what you're carrying, say the grip is just right for your hand, the button placements are right where you want them, and the screen goes to a certain direction you need it to go because you shoot low angle or high angle or from the side or whatever, that actually matters because you need to be comfortable with the gear that you're using, especially when the task gets challenging. You also need a realistic feel and need to be comfortable with, say, how fast the camera can be, how fast the autofocus is, how fast the reflex is, how fast the continuous burst shooting can be, because that's going to be crucial depending on the kind of workflow that you have. Now, if you're lucky enough to extensively test it out, then you can probably also take a peek at the files and be able to pixel peep the files. You can see if you're happy with the resolution of the camera, how clear the lens can be, or whatever. You can see how it would actually perform for the use case that you want to try, or at least try to emulate the use case so that you can have a better feel of it. And even on top of that, preference still matters. More importantly, preference, ergonomics, and context, use case, purpose, whatever word you prefer. Let me give you an example. I have an amazing photographer friend in her 60s. She likes shooting landscapes, but at the same time, she loves photographing birds. And at the same time, she loves shooting with her drone. And as you can imagine, she has all the access to all the gear she wants because, well, she can afford it. Now, regardless of how passionate she is with her craft and how energetic and physically fit she is, she has chosen, of course, a mirrorless camera and chose the lightest options when it comes to the individual lenses, but she still brings multiple lenses during her trip because she needs a telephoto, she needs a wide angle, and she needs a standard zoom. And on top of that, she would bring maybe an action camera so she can document what she does, and also her drone, which is, according to her, she would not sacrifice the image quality, so she brings a Mavic 4 Pro. So even if there are lighter options, she brings a lot of them and would carry them because she prefers to. Another example, just this week, I released an article about a lens that I say is really, really good and is something that I would bring for certain things and I wouldn't bring it for certain things because it's heavier than all of its other counterparts. And then in the comment section, there's this guy who's complaining about how photographers nowadays care so much about the gear, and during his time, it wouldn't matter whether it's heavy or not as long as it's sharp and it has the best resolution, yada yada yada. And then later on in the conversation, when someone engaged with him, he shot for decades inside the studio. Well, yes, in the studio, you wouldn't matter how heavy the lens is because you can always set it down. You don't have to carry it on your back for hours and hours because you probably drive to the studio. But if you're a landscape photographer and say the difference of a few 100 grams with say 3 or 4 different lenses, that would matter, especially if you are walking for 8 to 12 hours during that day. The point is that we tend to forget context. We tend to forget that gear isn't just gear, that a 35mm isn't just a 35mm, that 910 grams isn't always just 910 grams. 910 grams can feel like 20 kilograms if you're walking with it for 8 hours during that day. There's no such thing as the best camera, especially not if you can't have the energy to pick up that camera anymore because you wore yourself out hiking to a certain location. I just feel like we can have more meaningful conversations, more productive conversations, if we start thinking that what might be applicable to me is not applicable to you. And that's precisely why it can be hard for me sometimes to do gear reviews, because it shouldn't just be about how I would use it. Or if I am limited in terms of opinion with a certain use case, then I have to say that this might be applicable to me but not applicable to you. We can start having better conversations about gear if we can just have that respect and we can have an open mind about how others might think. And that's why I always say, if you have reactions, you have comments, leave them down below. But I don't always respond as instantaneously because I also want to be able to consider where your comments are coming from. So yes, always remember purpose, ergonomics, and preferences whenever talking about gear with someone else. And I am looking forward to more meaningful conversations with everyone. And as I usually say, if you have reactions, even if they're negative reactions, do leave them down below in the comment section. And if you've made it this far into the video and you heard me out, thank you so much. And if you're new to the channel, of course, my name is Nicco Valenzuela. I am a landscape and architectural photographer. And in this channel, I talk about the gear a lot and I talk about the process as well. So if you're into that, then do click that subscribe button and hit that notification bell. In any case, thanks for watching.